Dear Professor Harari, in your book, 21st Lessons for the 21st Century, you write that in the 21st century, it will become more and more normal for people to not only have one job, but to switch from job to job, or even have multiple jobs at the same time. And this is also true for yourself.
Yeah.
First, you are a historian. Second, and this is surprising for a historian, you're also a pop star. Your books, Sapiens, Homo Deus, and the aforementioned 21st Lessons for the 21st Century are absolute bestsellers and have been translated to around 50 languages, I think, among them also Ukrainian.
Mm-hmm.
Your talent is not only that you have the deep and detailed knowledge typical for historians, but that you are also able to explain and make this knowledge accessible for people from different professions who may not have studied history at all. Your writings are pointed, thought-provoking, and on top of that, great fun. More than once did I laugh out loud when reading. This is true. All these skills that you have been mastering towards perfection are essential for becoming and staying a good educator, a good teacher. Professor Harari, welcome to the community of Ukrainians independent, self-dependent school teachers. Welcome to EdCamp.
Thank you very much. I'm grateful for this invitation and for the opportunity to talk with all the educators and teachers here.
Thank you. So let's start with why we're here today. Education. You say that in earlier times, knowledge was scarce and even the little information you could receive about the world was reserved for elites and censored for the public.
Yes.
When modern schools came along, they therefore focused on teaching basic facts, so more information was available, which was an immense improvement.
Yeah.
Today, we live in an entirely different world. The powerful have realized that they cannot block information anymore. So instead, they flood us with even more information, misinformation, distractions, irrelevances. For us today, it's not hard to receive information. It's hard to find out what is true and what is false, what
exactly
to believe, what not. So, Professor, what shall we do? How should teachers act in the situation of change, uncertainty, and information overflow? Can we still contribute at all?
Yes, you have very important contribution, but no longer by just providing pupils with information. They don't need more information, they have too much of it. What you really should focus on, all of us should focus on, is giving pupils the skills to identify what is a reliable source of information and what isn't, whom to trust and who not to trust, how to critically think about the information we receive. You know, we are now in the middle of a global pandemic of the coronavirus, and it's a good example. In the Middle Ages, people had no information at all about when the Black Death spread. In the 14th century, there was no information. Nobody knew what is causing the disease, how it spreads, how it can be stopped. Now with coronavirus, there is enormous amount of information. Some of it is good, reliable scientific information about viruses, how they mutate, how they spread, but much of it is just ridiculous conspiracy theories. So people have this difficulty who to believe. And it's the responsibility of teachers to equip students so that when they are in this situation, they know how to distinguish between reliable information and conspiracy theories. So one way to do it is just by basic scientific education. Like today, when somebody comes to you and tells you some conspiracy theory about the spread of coronavirus, just ask this person, a simple question. Please tell me, what is a virus and how it causes disease? If the person doesn't know, it can't give you a clear answer, they have no clue what a virus actually is, don't believe anything else this person is telling you about coronavirus. You don't need a PhD in biology, you just need basic scientific understanding. So this is, for example, a simple guideline that teachers can give students about how to evaluate the information. They should teach students about how scientific knowledge is actually produced and evaluate it. And this will give the students another tool to know what to believe and not what not to believe. And of course, there are many other tools. These are just two examples. But the idea is to focus not on teaching particular bits of information, but in giving students tools how to search for information by themselves and how to evaluate by themselves what is reliable, what is unreliable. Of course, this is much more difficult than just providing bits of information. But that's the important task in the 21st century.
Absolutely. And you mentioned in your book the so-called formula for C's. And I think that critical thinking is part of it. So
Yes.
what are their strengths and limitations of these 4 C's?
Well, I mean, things like creativity and cooperation and critical thinking, they're always important, but they are doubly important in the rapidly changing world of the 21st century, and especially of the job market. If you don't have creativity and cooperation, it will be very difficult for you to keep, to keep learning throughout your life. In previous eras, like in the Middle Ages again, people learned most of the basic skills when they were young, children or teenagers, and then for the rest of their lives, they relied on the skills they acquired as youngsters. If you were a shoemaker or a farmer or any other profession, you relied on the skills you developed as a young person. Now it's completely different. You acquire certain skills in your as a teenager, as a child, but by the time you're 40, the world has changed so dramatically that you need to acquire completely new skills. And this is only accelerating. Actually, today, for the first time in history, nobody knows what the job market would look like in 20 or 30 years and what skills people will need. In the Middle Ages, of course, you couldn't predict the future. Who would be king in 20 years? Nobody knows. But at least you knew what kind of skills will be needed in the job market. If you live in Ukraine, in Kiev, in 1020, 1,000 years ago, you don't know who would be Prince of Kiev in 20 years, but you know that most people would be farmers, that it's good to teach your children how to plow a field or how to ride a horse or how to bake bread. They'll need it in 20 years. Now we don't know. So when you don't know what particular skills young people need, the best bet is to teach them how to learn, how to keep changing and learning throughout their lives. And this is what critical thinking and cooperation and communication are so important for.
Thank you, Professor Harari. Sometimes it happens that the connectivity issues come to our life, and the continuation of the interview will be done by phone. And the question we have now is about the current crisis with closed schools and largely inhabited public life, which represents a boost for digital technologies. Especially relevant for us are now online classrooms and video conferences. Though we are well adapting to the situation, we observe that we very often simply take our usual analog methods and transfer them into the digital space. Entirely new formats of fully digital teaching have not yet emerged on a large scale, for instance, in Ukraine. Does this show that we are not flexible enough in our minds? Or is this simply the usual human way of gradual adaptation, and we need to be patient with ourselves?
No, I think we are extremely flexible. It just takes time. I mean, we can't expect that habits that have been formed for decades, even centuries, can be changed just in a week or two. You know, sometimes the technology itself can be introduced very, very fast, but human habits take a little longer to adjust themselves. You know, now we are very used to having phone calls, but when phones were just introduced, this was a big revolution, and it took people many years to get comfortable with using phones. Now it seems like touching all technology, and it's just a normal part of life. So I think it also with the new, all these video conferencing technologies that are used in classrooms. I know that as a teacher, I've been teaching for 20 years in the university, and now I'm teaching these online courses. And I find it also quite difficult. I mean, the technology itself works well most of the time, but for instance, I find that at the end of the class, both me and the students are really exhausted, far more than during a normal class. And I think because it demands a much higher level of concentration. When I enter a physical class and I sit down and I talk with the students, so I can see all their faces and body movements, and I really have the feel of the class, of the atmosphere. And now when I sit in front of the computer, so okay, I see these small squares with these small faces of all the students, but to understand what's happening in the class, if they are bored or if they are interested, if they laugh for my joke, it demands far more attention and effort to get this information. So I find that after an hour and a half, I'm really exhausted. And the students are even, it's even more difficult for them because I teach only 3 classes like this, but they study every day. So I think it will take us much longer to understand how to make the best use of this new technology.
Thank you. In your recent article for the Financial Times, you described how the world may change over the long term because of the coronavirus pandemic, and how we should prepare for it. You gave some examples from your home country of Israel, which is particularly interesting for us, as the Embassy of Israel in Ukraine is a long-standing partner and friend of EdCamp. So please tell us how you are holding up there, and which changes in your personal environment do you expect to become relevant for the rest of the planet too?
It's difficult to say because the most important thing to realize about this crisis is that it is not predetermined, it's not deterministic, it's not like there is just one inevitable outcome that we are all going to experience. It really all depends on the choices we make. The crisis forces us to change the way we behave and live, but there are different options of how to do it. One important option is whether to face the crisis through global solidarity, different countries helping each other, or whether through nationalistic isolation. And it's not determined. I think that working with global solidarity is much better. It will help us deal with the crisis more easily, and it will create a better world afterwards. But I don't know. It depends on politicians, and politicians in different countries make different decisions. And it's the same within countries. You can face the crisis by having these authoritarian systems or authoritarian regimes giving dictatorial powers to governments and employing the police and the secret police to spy on people. Or you can face the crisis in a democratic way by relying on the willing cooperation of the population, by giving them information. I think that it's much better to deal with the crisis in a democratic way. A well-informed and self-motivated population is usually far more efficient than an ignorant and policed population. When people can trust the information they receive and they have a good scientific education, they understand the information they get, usually it works much better than if you have to police everybody. Just think about telling people to wash their hands. So one way to do it is to put a policeman or a camera in every toilet and punish people who don't wash their hands. The other method is to teach people, maybe in school, what are viruses and bacteria and how they cause disease and how you can get viruses and bacteria on your hands, and that if you wash your hands with soap, you can remove or kill these viruses and protect your health. And if people know that, you don't need to put a policeman in the toilet. You can just rely on their own intelligence so that they do the right thing. And I think that this is far more efficient. Now, in some countries, I do see a tendency towards more dictatorial measures. In Israel, one of the dangerous developments is that the surveillance of people, like people who got to know who is sick and the people who are sick, who they met, and so forth, the surveillance system has been given to the secret police to do this. And I think this is very dangerous. It shouldn't be the business of the police to survey, to monitor citizens in such a way. I don't think that we need surveillance, but we need an independent healthcare authority that will deal with it, and not the police or the army or the security services, for several reasons. First of all, it's, when you give too much power to the security forces to spy on people, it can lead in the short term or in the long term to a dictatorship. And, people in Ukraine, many of them still remember the Soviet Union, so I think they understand fully well the danger of giving so much power to the police to spy on people, even if done in the name, even if it's done in the name of protecting people from disease. Once you have such a system and it's in place, and so it can start be using for other things. And also, what people often don't understand is that this is not a security crisis. I hear a lot of leaders and politicians all over the world saying things like, this is a war, we are now in war, and we need to fight this battle, and things like that. And this is a mistake. It's not a war. It's a health crisis. It has a very, very different logic. In war, you have enemies, human enemies. In this crisis, there are no human enemies. All the humans are together. They are friends of each other. In a war, the main thing, when you think about the image of a war, so you think about a soldier with a rifle storming forward. In a healthcare crisis, the basic image is a nurse in a hospital changing dirty bedsheets. It's all about giving care to people, not about fighting. So I think it's wrong to give security forces to be in charge of this crisis. If you want somebody to be in charge, a nurse is far better than a general, because a general thinks like a war. And here you need a different way of thinking, a way of thinking which is much more common among nurses and doctors. So I hope that Israel will, they gave it to the security forces because Israel, everything is militarized. Everything is in the end, they think about it in terms of security. But I hope that they will soon establish an independent epidemiological authority or healthcare authority, which will be in charge of it. And I hope that other countries around the world also will not give too much power to the security forces or to a single dictator, and deal with this crisis in a democratic way. Again, people in Ukraine, I think they understand maybe better than almost anywhere else in the world how dangerous it is to give dictatorial power to a government which is not accountable to the people. If you remember, for instance, in the 1930s, the way that the Soviet government starved millions of Ukrainians and other citizens. It was something, it wasn't a natural disaster. It wasn't a war. It was something that the government did to its own people because it could, because it has this dictatorial power. So even in such an emergency like we have now, it would be very dangerous to give too much power to a government that can just do whatever it wants, and it can turn this against the population.
Dear Professor Harari, dear listening educators, there are 5,000 of you today. We are approaching to the end of our session. It has been such an honor and great pleasure to have you here today. Yuval, thank you so much, and all the best to you and your coming projects. May you continue to be such an important flashlight for our sometimes dark time. And may everything you write to be translated into Ukrainian.
Thank you very much. I actually was in Ukraine, Kyiv, just last year in September, and I have plans to come again this September, hopefully by September it will be possible again to fly and to visit other countries. And I very much hope that Ukraine will face this crisis in a good way, and that it will receive help from friends all over the world, from Israel, from the European Union, and from other countries, and that we can face this crisis together.